Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the third webinar session of the World Government Summit COVID-19 and Government webinar series. I take great pleasure in welcoming you all to our session today. Our third session is titled The New Model of Education and Talent Creation in a Post-COVID-19 World. I take great pleasure in welcoming our two esteemed panelists today. Ben Nelson, founder, chairman, and CEO of Minerva Project, and Hind Al-Maalla, chief of innovation, happiness, and creativity from KHDA. I take great pleasure in welcoming both of you.
Thank you, Reem.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome. Today's session is going to be a really interesting one, and I think it caters to a lot of us. We have, there's been a lot of disruption from COVID-19 over the past period. The last 2 months, 3 months has really rapidly changed how governments, how institutes, and all of us are living our daily lives. One key question to ask is, what is the future of education? How is it going to look post-COVID-19? And I think, Ben, I'd love to start with you today, putting you on under a little bit of pressure to start first, but really wanting to understand what is the current situation, being on ground, dealing with education on a daily basis. What is the current situation we're dealing with? And what is the future going to be in regards to education?
Well, I think it's a very prescient question, because a lot of people focus about the future of education, ignoring what's happening today, as if COVID is still an abstraction. People say, "Oh, well, things happen in the spring semester, at least in the northern hemisphere, and in the fall things will be different." But what happened in the spring will inform what universities do in the fall, and what they do in the fall will inspire really the nature of the future of higher education. The move to online, on some regards, was a success, meaning there was an unexpected calamity. The whole world was impacted, yet most educational institutions found a way to continue delivery of their courses, such that education for most students was impacted, but not completely interrupted. But the reality was that, of course, the quality of what was happening was pretty bad. But much of the quality problems actually had nothing to do with the technology, right? If I'm delivering a 45-minute lecture, if I'm delivering in front of an audience of 200 sleeping students, or if I'm delivering it on Zoom, it's pretty much the same lecture. Zoom does not ruin my lecture. But the reality is that in most university campuses, if students say, "Oh, that's a bad class," or everything else, they just don't go. They're not engaged. They're sitting in the lecture hall. They're on another screen. There's something that isn't that meaningful for them, and then they just take care of their day-to-day lives. And the reality is that when you're home and you've got nothing else to do, and this is what you are paying, and when I say you, it could be the student, a philanthropist, government, doesn't matter who the funder of education is, this is all you get from a university. That's not acceptable. And so most universities have one of two bad reactions to their experience in the spring. Reaction number one is, it's all the technology's fault. Technology doesn't work, and I can't wait to get back to campus where things can go back to normal. The problem is, normal isn't particularly good. And we can talk a lot about the statistics about how employers are not satisfied with university output, et cetera. We've known that for a long time. We've all been to university. How many of us have really think, "Oh wow, every single class I took at a university changed my life"? Far from it. Not even the majority of those classes. And at the same time, there are other perspectives that say, wow, we did such a great job. We moved our lecture and it felt super. Students were gratified that we didn't end the semester. And boy, that's a shot in the arm. Well, it's true that students may have been happy that they didn't have to drop their class in the middle of the semester, but it isn't the same thing. The smart universities, and we are talking to a number of those institutions, are actually having a real conversation with their faculty. And the message is clear. You have to do more than you're doing in your offline class. You can get away with things in a regular classroom environment where students can opt not to come. They have a campus, they have other things to occupy their interest. But you can't get away with that when this is the only representation of the university. And those institutions that will actually deliver a higher quality education in a remote setting than they do in an offline setting, they're the ones that are going to change the face of the future of higher education. Because they're going to be the ones that all of a sudden produce better educational outcomes. And that'll put pressure on other universities to reform in the future.
Thank you, Ben. I think one thing to think about is, where does Minerva Project come into all of this? And you rightly say that it's not just about going online, which defines success. It's not just about using technology per se. So what are the things that Minerva Project are doing? What is Minerva Project? I'm sure everybody in the audience would love to know more about it. Just before you get to that, I would love to even ask the audience, this is a conversation between all of us. So please do send your questions through the Q&A box. I know there are many people from around the globe signed in today, so please also do mention where you're sending in the question from, so that we can ask Ben and him today.
Sure. So happy to talk about that. So we set out almost 10 years ago to build what is not a good university or a great university, but the world's best university by any measure that contains or that focuses on student outcomes. We weren't trying to produce the most research. We weren't trying to have the most beautiful campus or the greatest facilities, but we were actually focused on a strange thing, which is called learning. And we believe that that is ultimately the goal of the most important goal of the university's interface with society. Research is certainly a very important aspect and shouldn't be ignored, but it shouldn't come at the expense of education. And so when we thought about, well, okay, how do you create the world's best education? What is necessary to produce that? We stepped back and we said, well, you know what? You have to rethink what you teach. You have to rethink how you teach, right? The pedagogy. But there was something even more important that when we looked at the nature of education at universities, which is that the education at universities is delivered by disparate, uncoordinated individuals, right? And so those individuals, the professors, have 100% control of their classroom, which is great, but there's no coordination from one professor to another. So if you study something in an economics class and then you take a political science class, the political science professor has no idea what you actually know, or if you took that economics class. And so in many regards, unless you're going into deep concentration in a particular field, right, where something say, well, you know, in order to take second semester physics, you have to take first semester physics. But even in that scenario, the second semester physics professor will reteach the first semester of physics in the first month because they don't have high confidence that they'll learn, that you've learned what you were supposed to in Physics 101. And so we realized that we needed to have in a university learning environment that was data rich, where we could enable students to have particular cognitive tools that all of their professors were confident that students could use, and they would have data on the facility of those students with those cognitive tools. And we realized that in order to do that, you actually cannot deliver an advanced education offline. Data collection and usage in an offline environment doesn't work. And so 6 years ago, when we started our first instantiation of Minerva, all the students came and lived together. It was a residential university, but 100% of their classes were done via live video. And so when COVID hit, of course, and this wasn't the reason that we did what we do, and in fact, students were not only residential, they took advantage of the flexibility of our education, such that our students live in 7 different countries by the time they graduate. They travel as a cohort around the world. They apply their learnings into real world situations as well. But when COVID hit, even though we had students in residence in 4 different countries at that time, and most of them had to kind of rush home, we ended our semester on time. We didn't have to move to pass-fail for any of our classes. None of our students were forced to end their education or change the quality of their education in any way, because the model that we built was resilient to those types of shocks.
Thank you, Ben. It's lovely to hear how Minerva was able to take the current situation and already be prepared well in advance. I think I'd love to interject here with Hind al-Mu'alla and ask about what is Dubai's experience in terms of education? What is happening for the future of our kids?
Yeah. Thank you, Reem. When it comes to what's happening, the situation since it started, let's say 2 months ago, what's happening to everybody is the mental image or the mental model of education is shifting. What people are expecting from education and their perception to it is shifting. I'm not saying that what's happening at the moment didn't happen before. It did, but it happened in pockets, in innovation pockets. It happened at an experimental level, but it didn't happen in a mass structure in the way it's happening now, where everybody moved from one delivery mechanism into another. So and now I think it's the great opportunity that among all of us, our perception and our image of education is changing, and that's a big thing.
Since you are in KHDA and it is a key authority in the UAE, what are your thoughts on schools reopening? And do you think when they reopen, they're going to be the same?
I think this is a very good question, Reem, and it's the same questions that is being asked by everybody. So when it comes to schools reopening, I think the most important thing will be the health and safety. So that's the most important thing. Everything else that happens is just the how of to maintain that health and safety and at the same time deliver education. Going back, reopening, things will change, delivery model will change, people has experienced something, the students has experienced something, and the schools as well, and probably they would like to maintain some of these aspects, but definitely what will stay is that in a school, there are a number of things that happen. School and university is not a place where it just disseminates knowledge. It's not the cognitive aspect. There is a huge social aspect as well. And what the students are experiencing now is that social component is missing. A third aspect that when the schools reopen, and we believe that there will be a higher emphasis on, and there is a higher emphasis now, just as Ben said, what's happening now is important. It's not just what's going to happen in the future, is the well-being element. Well-being element, we will notice that the well-being element now and in the future will be at the heart of the education process.
Thank you, I think we've had a lovely introduction to our session in regards to the current status, what are key authorities, Minerva, KHDA, what is actually happening on the game field. I think I'd love to move into what is the role of governments in all of this, and where does that all come into play? So Ben, I'd like to maybe suggest this question to you, but it's more along the lines of, what is the role of governments? And there's always been a thing of standards and curriculums and measures and how students are graded in universities. And it's always been you either pass or fail or you get an A. do you believe this is going to change? And what is the impact of government in this per se? Is it their key priority to be looking into this?
Well, there's a statement which is never waste a good crisis. And I would imagine that certain governments around the world will seize upon that opportunity. Unfortunately, the current models of government regulation in education, I think, veer towards two extremes that are not necessarily that healthy, right? One extreme is the highly prescribed, right? You shall do X, Y, Z in your university. You have to offer a very rigid curriculum. There's really no room to wiggle in it, et cetera. And otherwise you're not certified. And effectively what that does is it forces universities to be in the business of the dissemination of knowledge, which, by the way, the internet does for free. And so it requires certification. And of course, you need university degrees. You need the certification in order to be doctors and lawyers and, much of the working class in around the world. And so because of that, you effectively force people to go through an educational process which is inefficient, costly, and really doesn't add value. Right, so that's kind of one extreme. The other extreme are the governments that say, well, we'll let universities regulate themselves, right, and do whatever you'd like, right? Yeah, you should, generally have 120 credit hours of seat time to have a bachelor's degree, but you can do it in any way you like. There are no standards. If you at this university have never issued an F ever, that's fine, right? You can actually just graduate every single student that shows up just because they're there. This other university that has 20% completion rates after 6 years for a 4-year degree, that's okay. We'll let you continue issuing degrees. Right, and that also doesn't work, right? And so what I think you need to do is kind of a balance. And the thing I think which the two models can learn from each other is having a diversity of approaches to education is a really, really good thing, right? Which is to say, hey, you know what? There are different models of education. There are different approaches, and we should let that competitive nature bloom. However, what's another good thing is to enforce standards, right? And so how do you do those two things? I think it's pretty simple. I think governments should say, we're going to have a truth in advertising law. If you as a university say, we teach our students to think critically, but you don't measure it, right? You're breaking the law, right? And you could go to jail, right? Because if you don't have backup, then you're basically misleading your students, right? So a university can choose. They can choose to actually teach their students to think critically, measure their progress, of which there are many, many measures, right? Demonstrate that they do that, or they could just stop saying that they do, right? And say, well, you know what? We teach you how to pass tests in physics. We don't necessarily teach you physics, but we do teach you how to pass the test. You'll forget everything right after you pass the test, but this is what we'll do. And then you get exposed to what universities actually provide. And so this is a way for governments to allow universities to have freedom to develop curricula and educational programs that make sense, but to make sure that what they advertise to students and employers are actually held accountable for.
Thank you, Ben. I think another key question and on the minds of many governments and different decision makers around the world is, when all of this happens and when we have so much rapid change, I think COVID-19 has been, it's brought a lot of opportunities to the table, but I think it's also highlighted where governments need to invest in regards to creating the right talent pools for their nations. How do we, what role does the education system, the government, the universities, how do we create an ecosystem that allows for sustainable talent pipelines? And what do you think are the key criteria for them to actually build sustainable talent pipelines?
That's such a crucial question. because oftentimes we look at the role of university is to educate students for particular jobs. This is a disastrous idea. I remember when I was an internet executive, and this was back about 15 years ago or so, there was an internet programming language called Ajax. And everybody was going to program everything in Ajax. Ajax was the future, right? 3 years later, I couldn't find a single program written in Ajax. It was extinct. So now imagine a forward-thinking government is told in 2005, oh my God, Ajax is the future. We've got to get our universities to train our students on Ajax. Well, the government would say, okay, let's kind of write that into law. That takes a year or so. Then they tell universities, start building that curriculum. That'll take 1 or 2 years. Then they start offering it, right? Then 4 years later, the first students graduate, maybe 5 years, because they take a year to actually explain to students what they're doing. So 8 years after the government would identify that you have this particular need, universities will graduate students with that skill. Well, guess what? That doesn't work, right? And the concept that universities in this modality of, deep curricular planning and 4 years of delivery can actually respond to identifiable market needs is absurd. It doesn't work. Instead, what universities should focus on are transferable cognitive tools, skills that you can deploy no matter what job you pursue. And that's actually the role of universities when you really think about it. It's not to give you particular elements of knowledge, it's to help you deal with answering problems that you encounter that you've never encountered before. This is why universities talk about critical thinking and creative problem solving and effective communication and having global perspectives. It's just that they don't do it, because what they're doing is they're disseminating knowledge around particular fields, right? And so if a university instead focuses on these transferable skills, focuses on the seminal ideas that underpin fields, right? Principles of science, principles of market economics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then they could offer small implementations to say, oh, you know what, in your senior year, what's a hot language now? Let's do Ajax. Okay, well, you can study Ajax right now in application of what you studied in the first 3 years of undergraduate, right? Such that maybe if you're interviewing for a job now, you can say, hey, I also have that skill, right? But that's not where government should be focused on. Government should be ensuring that the core element of what a university education does, the first 2 or 3 years, is effective. And again, it should be effective in such a way that universities are simply held accountable. Universities aren't unaware of what they should be teaching. This is why this is in their marketing language, but they're not held accountable to actually deliver it.
I think you've put it down perfectly in regards to what the criteria is and where governments actually need to be focused on, and where institutions like perhaps the ministries of education, the universities, all collectively work together. I think one thing to ask and is, where do you think, after all that Ben said and all the different criteria, what is KHDA's key takeaways from all that's happening, and where does it play a role in all of this?
One of the things, the takeaways is that here in UAE, I think we're blessed to have a visionary leadership. So when everything was, certain sectors of the economy were put on hold, education actually is on the fast lane. So it's happening, and it's happening all the time. So one of the takeaways we take from this is the element of collaboration. I think it's very important to create opportunities for collaboration, between the government and the private, between educational institutes themselves to collaborate and learn from each other, between teachers, between students, and so on. In KHDA, we created a number of platforms for collaboration because we think it's important in general, but during such times, it has a much bigger importance level. For example, we have a platform called In This Together, where all the community can come in and chip in to support the education system. We used to have something called What Works series, and thousands of educators went through them. Now this series has moved online. It's called What Works X. And the amazing thing is that without the limitation of the physical surroundings, we are running them twice a week. We used to have them twice a semester or twice a year. And we have hundreds of educators interested to share what's working in their experiences. Now, another takeaway from this experience is actually, and I'll say that we are blessed with a visionary leadership because, for example, in Dubai, we have an institute called the Dubai Future Foundation. And what this foundation did is that actually it created a window to the future where all government entities, each in their own industry and discipline, manage to have a glimpse and to be prepared. So this really helped us. They have a number of programs and we collaborate with them on a number of programs such as the Dubai Future Accelerators and the 10X program. 3 years ago, His Highness Sheikh Mohammed announced that I want the government to be operating 10 years ahead. So we thought, okay, in collaboration with the Dubai Future Foundation, a program called Rahal was born. And mainly what Rahal was doing and is still doing 3 years ago is actually what's happening now at a mass level. So that's such structures within the government help the collaboration and help the future thinking and actually coming up with the processes that will support us in general and during times of crisis.
Thank you, Hind, for that. I think one question to also ask is, I think there's a major fear. There's so many people graduating around the world. There's a lot of graduation ceremonies actually, which perhaps just took the last week. And all of it was done online. The human element was lost. And what is your key advice, Hind and Ben, to all the university students who've just graduated? Some might feel, are they going to feel the fact that, oh, do I have the right skills? And what is your best advice to them?
I'll leave Ben start.
So yes, look, I would advise looking at one of three paths. Again, crises are also opportunities, right? And so as awful, and it is hard to mince words about how awful the global pandemic is and the ravaging impact on human life and the economy in different sectors is. At the same time, it also provides a number of opportunities to think and do something different, right? So as an example, you know, I'm not suggesting a recent graduate start an airline, but people who want to start airlines can basically buy airplanes for free. They can create labor contracts with pilots and flight attendants and baggage carriers and all the rest for a much more rational level of cost than maybe existing airlines. If you have an interesting idea in hospitality, there's going to be a lot of real estate that is going to open up, right? Storefront, hotels, buildings, etc. And so on the one hand, this is a really good time, and maybe not today, maybe a year from now, maybe 6 months from now, but it's a good time to start thinking about entrepreneurship and redefining the reality of the world. The second aspect is there are still fields that are booming. And of course, you should be looking at fields that are going to be sustainably boomed. So rather than saying, well, right now, food delivery is the biggest thing in the world, let me get into the food delivery business. Well, that may be true, But when things open up, my guess is the food delivery business will crash, right? So that may not be the best industry to pursue. Maybe it is for a short-term period, but you're going to have a different issue later. But think about those things that are harbingers of the future. What is accelerated? So for example, unlike food delivery, I think that e-commerce is going to continue to gain ground, right? Because the nature of large retailers being able to attract customers to come back to their stores will mean that many stores will shutter. But that means that alternative retail could be interesting, people that have a hybrid approach. So that's a second focus. And the third focus is reskilling. One of the things that we did at Minerva is we launched a program called a Visiting Scholars Year. And it's largely targeted towards students who may be uncertain about going back to their universities for this academic year, and gives them credit-bearing options to actually help them think systematically. But what we've actually just seen is a number of recent graduates or soon-to-be graduates who realize they don't have the cognitive tools they need to be successful in a very tough job market, are saying, hey, can I take this year to actually bone up on my systematic thinking skills, such that when I interview 7 or 8 months from now for a job, I can actually impress my employer. I can actually provide them a reason to hire me. And so programs like that, you know, our Visiting Scholar Year is an example of it, that actually help you provide systematic thinking that will help you pursue any job that you may want, is sometimes a very good idea to do after a bachelor's degree that may have given you a major in a particular field that is not leading you to the kind of employment that you'd want to, or any employment at all.
And to add to what Ben said, one of the things that we run here in Dubai is a well-being census, and what we ask students about, and we want, and the learners in general, we want the, let's say, the characteristics that comes with that is resilience, perseverance, relationships. So these are, we believe, is just as important as actually the content and the knowledge they receive from their educational institutes. So regardless of the situation, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's any other element, if you have these elements, then you will definitely have the skills and the abilities to turn it into something positive.
Thank you, Hind. Thank you, Ben. I think one more thing to address is I think we're all curious about the applications of people to Minerva's universities, in the sense we know it's extremely hard, and the screening process is quite difficult. I want to ask two questions. Why have we created such a screening system? And two, what are your thoughts on education for all after COVID-19? Because the whole world was working together to try to reduce the poverty gap, the inequality gap that was widening, and it was finally starting to get on track, and now we've got COVID-19 again. So what are your thoughts on both of these issues, and where do you think education for all comes into play here?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And actually, they're highly related. So some of you may or may not know, Minerva is the most selective university in the United States. We actually just released our statistics for this year. We had record number of applications, 25,000 applicants from 180 some countries around the world. And our acceptance rate this year was, for the first time, just below 1%. And so it's extraordinarily selective process to be admitted to Minerva. Having said that, we also accept, we set an absolute standard of acceptance and accept every applicant that meets that standard. So what we don't do is we don't have a situation where we say, well, you know, of the 25,000 applicants, 5,000 are actually qualified to come to Minerva, but will only be able to offer 200 spots, right? So we don't have a concept of spots. And so the process inherently is fair. But what that means, and the reason that it is so hard to get into Minerva, is that we don't advantage wealth. And one of the things we have not talked about, and I'm glad you brought this up, is government's role in who gets educated, right? And I'll give you an example just from my own country, from the United States, but unfortunately it's true in many countries. Many countries will claim that they are providing access to education to everyone. They'll point to numbers that show, for example, in the United States, that adults today that have a college degree that were born in the bottom 20 percentile, right, the bottom quintile of the socioeconomic distribution in the United States, now have college going rates that are 50% higher than they were 50 years ago. That's great. The problem is that those born into the top 20% have double the college attainment as they did 50 years ago. And so despite that you can point to some advances, the fact of the matter is universities have become less inclusive. They've become more focused on the rich, and need-blind institutions like American Ivy League universities wind up having need-blind processes, yet 50% of their student body or more come from the 1% wealthiest households in the world, right? So if you believe that that's a need-blind process, you clearly have not learned your statistics lesson. And so what we have done is we flipped that on its head. We charge well under half for tuition fees, room and board than a typical private American university, right? Like a Harvard or a Stanford. Yet 80% of our students can't afford it, right? And that's simply because we don't advantage rich applicants in the application process. And so the reason that we're so selective is that somebody has to pay for these students' education. So we have to raise scholarship funds, right? And if we were to include more students, right, then we'd be bankrupt. We wouldn't be able to raise the scholarship funds that are necessary to have a larger class. So you always have this tension, right? The visiting scholars year that I mentioned, you don't become a Minerva student, you're just in taking a year's worth of courses. And so getting into that program is quite easy, right? You just are able to go in and take the classes, right? And the classes are still small and intimate. They're with great professors. You get credit, but there isn't an admissions wall. But even though they're delivered online, you can take them from anywhere in the world, but it costs money, right? And so when you say, hey, let me have open access, by definition, somebody has to pay for it. And again, even though it's a fraction of what a year at an American university costs, it still is unattainable for a lot of people around the world. And so where governments can really step in isn't just to subsidize poor students, because what happens is that those subsidies wind up getting gobbled up by universities, and then they just raise costs and prices and make themselves less accessible. What I've long been advocating is that governments go to universities and say, look, you're independent institutions, you can do whatever you'd like. However, if you want money from the government for research, being nonprofits and being tax subsidized, having government subsidies for tuition of any kind, the student makeup of your institution, for at least the domestic students, needs to broadly be reflective of the socioeconomic distribution of the country. You could do it in deciles, quintiles, etc. But you know what? 25% of your student body must come from the 25% poorest neighborhoods in the city or in the country, and so forth and so on. And instantly, universities would have to respond or they'd lose a substantial amount of their funding. And so governments have a responsibility, again, to give universities flexibility in defining it, but to say, you know what, if a taxpayer subsidizes your operation, you cannot primarily serve the rich. Doesn't make sense.
Thank you, Ben. This discussion has been very fruitful, but we are running a bit short on time. So I'd love to move to the next segment. We do have a poll for our audience, and after this session and this discussion, we'd love to see what our audience thinks about a few of these issues. So it'll be popping up on your screens shortly. Expect education to permanently change in a post-COVID world? And then, do you expect the landscape of education providers to change post-COVID-19? So surprisingly, or not surprisingly, there's 91% of the attendees believe that yes, education is going to permanently change, and even the landscape is going to change. So I think that does give a lot of perspective to what we've been discussing today. I'd love to take a few questions before we close off today from the lovely audience who's tuned in. The first one has been directed to Ben and is coming from South Africa. The question is, what will be the best way to reach and offer quality education to those students who are residing in remote areas, who do not have the means to receive virtual or modern education in a post-COVID-19 world?
It's a great question, and it's a huge problem, but it is one that it can begin to be addressed now. So there are more and more satellite internet networks, that are being launched around the world specifically to target hard to reach wireline infrastructure internet access. And I believe that over the next 1 to 2 years, you're going to see almost global coverage, at least with access to high-speed internet. And governments play a huge role in this, right? Given these types of bandwidth opportunities, you can get devices into those areas for relatively cheap, right? With solar power generation, et cetera. And you can bring very high quality instruction into those particular areas. Now, depending on the nature of that rural environment, you will probably need to deploy human capital as well, especially in a K-12 setting. You need to go in and change a culture of education. You need to introduce formal education in some areas that are not used to it, but you can supplement the on-the-ground, effectively a daycare element of education with the very best educational tools that can come in via the internet. So technology has to be a solution to this, but you have to look at it both from infrastructure as well as programming married with live in-person assistance.
There's one more question, Ben, and then I'll share one with Hind. But this one's from the UK. How do you see the integration of laboratory-based teaching into an online delivery method? Does Minerva online classes include live online video practicals, example, specialist STEM teaching facilities? And how do you get those laboratory-based teaching moving forward?
So I think lab-based teaching is certainly important. My father is a bench scientist and has been for his entire life. He's 82. He's still on the bench every day. And so I understand, certainly from a firsthand perspective, the importance of doing lab science. I also understand that lab science classes have almost nothing to do with lab science. A class environment of, okay, now run a gel and sees that something that you expect to happen happens is not what real science is. Science is about hypothesis testing and discovery. It takes a long, long time. And yes, it's important to get some physical dexterity in running gels, but frankly, the kind of science that is done in my father's era and that he's still doing to this day is now largely automated. And so, whereas rather than trying to replicate a lab class experience, which is fundamentally not that useful, what we do is we try to integrate our students into real lab research as research assistants, in corporations, in university labs, et cetera, all over the world, right? And so again, as I said, the research endeavor of universities is crucial. And yes, there is a role that universities play in bringing about students, especially as they progress in the latter years of their undergraduate career and masters and PhDs, to have that ability. But much more science is now done with data and understanding how to manipulate and deal with data rather than the mechanical elements that are required on the bench. And so it's an important component, but far more important is knowing what to do with putting together hypotheses and how to test them and understanding intuitively what the experiential method is, or the scientific method is all about, and then being able to analyze and evaluate the data that you get. And that's really the types of tools that we focus on, that once our students are in labs, this is why they excel.
Thank you. I think this is a perfect synergy from going to labs to, we've got a question for Hind, which is, a lot of educators worry about the delivery mechanism of education today being free of interacting with students, and being an innovation, creativity and happiness part of your portfolio. Do you think there is a large reason of fear of the lack of social interaction by students and teachers? And do you think this is a key element which definitely should be part of an education process moving forward?
Yeah, it's a very good question. May I know who is asking it? Do you have a name, Reem?
Unfortunately, I don't at the moment.
Okay. So whoever is asking the question, thank you. I think it's a very good question. And teacher and student relationship is a very important component of the education process, the teaching and learning process. Teacher presence is very important, and that presence, whether it's physical or whether it's to different mechanisms, online is one of them, but there are also other delivery, and the presence mean actually is being there, preparing within the experience, checking, providing feedback, seeing if the students showing the care during the process. So whether it's physical or whether it's digital, it's of great importance, and it can be delivered by teachers.
Thank you, Hind. Ben and Hind, I'd like to ask both a question. What is your biggest to governments, to students, if you had one thing to say to them in regards to advising them for the next few years ahead, what is your one advice that you would give them?
Well, to governments, again, I would reiterate, do not waste this crisis. And this is an opportunity for governments to infuse data into education and to hold universities accountable. But holding them accountable in most countries actually means loosening the direction you give, right? But making sure that they live up to what they say they do. And I think if a government follows that simple principle, their education sector will absolutely blossom, and the outcomes for the country would be dramatic. And for students, I would say the same thing. I think that there's no clearer time than a global recession to realize that education matters. And when I say education matters, I don't mean certification, because certification does not matter, right? I've lived through a couple of very big global recessions. And I can tell you about graduates from, my alma mater, Ivy League University, top program in the world, blah, 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 couldn't get jobs, right? The ones who had jobs got fired. And I know people from my institution who drove taxis. This is at a time when taxis still existed, before Uber wiped them all out, right? And the reality is that the brand that you carry on your resume doesn't get you very far. What gets you far is how well you think, how you can demonstrate your intellect and wisdom. And so for students, vote with your feet. Students have enormous power right now with universities. They are desperate for students to show up in the fall. And this is a time for students to say, you know what, your plan on your education is not going to prepare me well. I'm not paying for this, right? I demand something better. Find different pathways of education that are actually tied to outcomes. And students have the power to influence universities kind of bottoms up, and governments have that power tops down. And if they work in unison, you could have a seismic shift in education.
The situation we are in reminds me of a sci-fi movie. I mean, it's from a different era now. It was called Back to the Future. And it's we are going through a situation very similar to that, where actually we are in the future in a way. So let's make use of whatever we're doing now to have even a better future. I came across a quote. I'm sorry, I don't remember who, but it resonated to me. And it says, educational structures are one of the most rigid inventions of humans. And what my advice to, whether it's government, whether it's educational institutes, whether it's parents or learners, is actually something to drop and something to take forward. What I would say is to drop is the rigidity. So just leave that behind. I mean, Ben spoke about the admission criteria. He spoke about the progress criteria, the quality assurance model, and so on. So there is a lot that we can drop behind and really maintain and keep what matters. And from this crisis, whoever we are, whether a private institution or government, what we need, or even individuals, humans, what we need to take with us actually is humbleness. What this pandemic taught us is to be humble. When you are humble, what you will do is you will listen. We will listen to each other. We will learn from each other, and we'll be less proud. Pride prevents so many changes from happening. So let's be less proud of what we have and look for the next better thing that we can have.
Thank you, and thank you, Ben. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of our session, and I thank the audience for sending so many lovely and insightful questions. And thank you for this insightful session. I think I'd love to end on one of the quotes that Ben had mentioned previously. Nothing is more important for the world than nurturing critical wisdom. And I think collectively putting this all together, I leave you, everyone today, on the notes of let's hope for a better future for our education, and let's hope that we can tackle issues yesterday rather than tomorrow. We have a small survey right after we log off.